When he walked through that door, I knew immediately something wasn't right. The way he avoided my eyes, the way he set his bag down so carefully, like it contained a bomb that might explode at any moment. 8 months of marriage, and I'd never seen David like this. It was March in Columbus, Ohio, and the last patches of dirty snow were finally melting outside our dream home. We'd bought this 2-story colonial just 3 months earlier, and it still smelled like fresh paint and new beginnings. I remember standing in our living room that evening, adjusting the throw pillows for the 3rd time, lighting my favorite vanilla candle, feeling so proud of what we'd built together. At 26, I thought I had figured it all out. Marriage, homeownership, the perfect life I'd always planned. I was what you might call a control enthusiast. Everything had its place, every detail mattered, and I genuinely believed that if I could just manage everything perfectly, our life would be perfect too. That Tuesday evening, I had orchestrated the perfect welcome home for David after his week-long business trip to Seattle. His favorite dinner was warming in the oven, soft jazz played in the background, and I had arranged fresh flowers on the dining room table. I was wearing the blue sweater he'd complimented me on before he left, but the man who walked through our front door wasn't the same David who had kissed me goodbye 7 days earlier. This David moved like a stranger in our own home. He barely hugged me back when I rushed to greet him. His smile felt forced, mechanical. When I asked about his flight, his presentations, his colleagues, his responses came in clipped single syllables. Fine. Good. Okay. How was Seattle? I asked, following him as he carried his suitcase upstairs. Fine. Did the client like your software proposal? Yeah, they did. I watched him unpack with an efficiency that felt almost violent. Every movement seemed calculated to avoid looking at me directly. When I suggested we eat dinner together, he said he wasn't really hungry. When I mentioned watching our favorite show, he said he was tired. When I reached for his hand, he didn't quite pull away, but his fingers felt cold, unresponsive. The next morning, I convinced myself it was just travel exhaustion. Business trips were stressful. He'd been working long hours before he left. Maybe the project hadn't gone as well as he said. I made his favorite coffee, packed his lunch with little notes like I always did, kissed him goodbye with extra enthusiasm to compensate for whatever was bothering him. But he came home that evening the same way. Distant, polite, but distant. He ate dinner in front of the TV instead of at our table. He went to bed early, claiming he needed to catch up on sleep, but I could hear him shifting restlessly for hours. By the 3rd day, the careful politeness was eating at me. David, what's wrong? I asked as we stood in our kitchen, him making coffee, me hovering nearby. Nothing's wrong, Jess. I'm just tired. You've been tired for 3 days. This isn't tired. This is something else. He paused, coffee mug halfway to his lips. I'm fine, really. But he wasn't fine. And I knew it in the way that wives know things, in that deep, intuitive place that recognizes when the person you love most in the world is slipping away from you, inch by inch, day by day. The questioning became my daily ritual. What's wrong? I'd ask when he came home. Are you okay? I'd whisper when we passed in the hallway. Did I do something? I'd wonder aloud when he chose the couch over our bed for the 3rd night in a row. Each question was met with the same response. Nothing was wrong. He was just processing some work stress. He needed space to think. But his eyes told a different story. His eyes looked through me like I was a piece of furniture he'd grown tired of rearranging. By day 4, I was analyzing every conversation we'd had before he left, every text message, every moment I might have said or done something wrong. Had I been too demanding about the house renovations? Too particular about how the kitchen should be organized? Too insistent that his mother call before visiting? The questions spiraled in my mind like water circling a drain. I started watching him the way you might watch a stranger you suspect of shoplifting. I noticed how he positioned his body away from mine when we sat together. I saw how he checked his phone more frequently, how he seemed to deliberately time his showers for when I was busy elsewhere. I felt like a detective in my own marriage, collecting evidence of my husband's unhappiness without understanding what crime I was supposed to have committed. Day 5 brought a new level of desperation. I couldn't eat. I couldn't focus on work. I kept replaying our last normal conversation, searching for clues I might have missed. I called in sick and spent the day cleaning our already spotless house, organizing closets that didn't need organizing, anything to burn off the nervous energy that was consuming me from the inside out. That evening, when David came home and headed straight for his laptop without even acknowledging me, something inside me snapped. I had been patient. I had been understanding. I had been giving him space. But I was drowning in the silence between us, and I couldn't take another day of being treated like a roommate in my own marriage. I found him on the couch, typing emails, completely absorbed in his screen. And before I could stop myself, before I could think about whether this was the right approach or the wrong approach, I climbed onto the couch and sat directly on his lap. I grabbed his face with both hands and forced him to look at me. "What is wrong with you?" The words came out louder than I intended, sharper than I meant them to be. "Something is wrong, and you won't tell me what it is, and I can't keep living like this." For a moment, he just stared at me. I saw something flicker in his eyes, something that looked almost like relief mixed with resignation. It was the first real emotion I'd seen from him in 5 days. Then he said the words that would change everything. "I need some time, Jess." The way he said it, so quietly, so carefully, made my stomach drop. This wasn't about a bad day at work, or stress about a project deadline. This was bigger. Much bigger. "Time for what?" I whispered, but even as I asked, I knew I didn't want to hear the answer. Time to think. Time to figure out what I want. Time to understand what's happening here. I felt myself start to shake. "What do you mean, what's happening here? We're married. We just bought a house. We're building a life together. What is there to figure out?" But David just looked at me with those sad, distant eyes. "I just need some time." The word time hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't 20 minutes to cool off after an argument. This wasn't a week to work through a rough patch. This was the kind of time that ended marriages. This was the kind of time that separated homes into his things and her things. I started crying then. Not the pretty tears you see in movies, but the ugly, desperate sobbing of someone watching their world collapse in real time. "I don't understand," I kept saying. "I don't understand what happened. I don't understand what I did wrong." David sat there, perfectly still, while I fell apart on top of him. He didn't try to comfort me. He didn't tell me everything would be okay. He just repeated in that same quiet, careful voice, "I need some time to process this. I need some space to think." "Think about what?" I demanded through my tears. "Think about whether you want to be married to me? Think about whether you love me? What exactly are you thinking about, David?" But he couldn't answer that question, or wouldn't answer it. He just sat there letting me cry, letting me break down completely, while he remained perfectly, terrifyingly calm. Eventually, he helped me off his lap and stood up. He gathered his laptop, his phone, his keys. "I'm going to stay at Sarah's for a few days," he said, referring to his sister who lived across town. "I'll call you." And then he left. Just like that. He walked out of our dream home, our perfect life, our 8-month marriage, leaving me alone on the couch with my tears and my questions and my complete bewilderment. I sat there for a long time, after his car pulled out of our driveway, staring at my left hand. My wedding ring caught the light from the lamp beside me, the same ring he'd placed on my finger 8 months earlier, while promising to love me for better or worse, in sickness, and in health until death do us part. I twisted it around my finger, feeling its weight for the first time. Had it always been this heavy? Had I just never noticed before? How could 8 months of happiness disappear in a single sentence? How could "I need some time" erase I love you, and I choose you, and forever. How could the man who had spent 3 months house hunting with me, who had painted our bedroom walls by hand, who had talked about children and vacation plans and growing old together, suddenly need time to think about whether he wanted to be married to me? I sat on that couch until nearly midnight, turning my wedding ring around and around my finger, feeling like it might slip off at any moment, wondering if that would be a sign of something, wondering if anything would ever feel solid again. The house felt enormous around me, filled with all the dreams we'd shared and all the silence he'd left behind. Outside, the last of winter's snow was melting away, preparing for spring. But inside our home, inside our marriage, it felt like winter was just beginning. The first day he was gone, I spent 14 hours on Google. My search history looked like a cry for help. How to save your marriage when only one person is trying. Why do husbands suddenly become distant? Signs your spouse is done with the marriage. How to win back your husband's love. Emergency marriage advice. I was supposed to be in Nashville for my college roommate's bachelorette party. The irony wasn't lost on me, celebrating someone else's upcoming marriage while mine was potentially falling apart. But I'd committed to this trip months ago, bought the plane ticket, booked the hotel room, and frankly, I needed to get out of that house. Every corner of our dream home now felt like a crime scene where my marriage had died, and I couldn't bear to spend another night alone in our king-size bed, staring at David's empty pillow. So there I was, sitting cross-legged on the scratchy carpet of a DoubleTree hotel room in Nashville, my laptop burning hot against my thighs, while my friends were downstairs getting ready for dinner at some trendy honky-tonk. I could hear them laughing and singing through the thin walls, the sound of women who had normal relationships, normal problems, normal Friday nights that didn't involve frantically searching the internet for marriage salvation. I am, by nature, a fixer. When something breaks, I research until I find a solution. When there's a problem, I create a plan to solve it. When life gets messy, I organize it back into something manageable. This approach had served me well in college, in my career, in every area of my life except apparently my marriage. But I couldn't just sit there and do nothing. I couldn't accept that David needed time without understanding what that meant or what I could do about it. The first few hours of research were both hopeful and devastating. Hopeful because clearly I wasn't alone. Thousands of women had typed variations of my exact questions into search engines. Devastating because most of the advice was either completely generic or utterly depressing. Give him space. Focus on yourself. Sometimes marriages just end. These weren't solutions. They were surrender flags. I dove deeper, clicking through relationship blogs, marriage counseling websites, psychology articles, and forum discussions where desperate wives shared their stories of husbands who had suddenly checked out. The recurring themes started to emerge. Communication breakdowns, unmet needs, growing apart, midlife crises, affairs, depression, work stress. But none of it felt specific enough to my situation. David and I communicated constantly. We'd just bought a house together. He wasn't going through a midlife crisis at 28. As far as I knew, there wasn't another woman. The mainstream marriage advice all sounded the same, recycled through different websites and books like a broken telephone game. Use I statements instead of you statements. Learn each other's love languages. Schedule regular date nights. Practice active listening. Express your feelings without blame. Create intimacy through shared experiences. I had tried all of these things. I had read The 5 Love Languages twice. I knew David's was acts of service, which was why I packed his lunches and organized his schedule and handled all the household management. I knew mine was quality time, which was why his sudden distance felt like starvation. We'd been on date nights just the week before he left for Seattle. We'd communicated about everything from our future children's names to where we wanted to retire. None of the standard relationship advice addressed what to do when your husband suddenly became a polite stranger who needed time to think. By hour 6 of my research marathon, I was getting desperate. I started reading divorce recovery blogs. thinking maybe they would give me insight into what David might be feeling. I read articles about the stages of relationship breakdown, the psychology of emotional withdrawal, the warning signs that someone was preparing to leave. Each article felt like a punch to the stomach because I could recognize elements of David's behavior in every description. My friends texted periodically throughout the evening. "Where are you? Come down and get ready. We're leaving for dinner in 20 minutes. I sent back excuses about feeling sick, needing to make work calls, having a headache. The truth was, I couldn't imagine sitting in a restaurant pretending to care about bachelorette party games while my marriage was potentially ending. I couldn't fake interest in discussions about wedding venues and honeymoon destinations when I wasn't even sure if my own honeymoon phase was officially over. Around midnight, when the girls finally returned from their night out, drunk and giggling and full of stories about the hot bartender and the terrible karaoke, I pretended to be asleep. I listened to them whisper about what a great time they'd had and felt like I was eavesdropping on a life I used to have, back when my biggest concerns were whether to order the chicken or the fish, and whether that cute guy at the bar was actually flirting with me. I stayed awake until 3 a.m, reading relationship forums where women shared their stories of marriage crisis and recovery. Some had happy endings, husbands who came back, relationships that grew stronger after near collapse, couples who learned to communicate better through therapy. Others had devastating conclusions, men who left for other women, marriages that couldn't survive the break, divorces that split families apart. The next morning, I woke up with my laptop still open beside me, my neck stiff from sleeping at an awkward angle, and absolutely no more clarity than I'd had 14 hours earlier. If anything, I felt more confused and more hopeless. Everything I'd read essentially boiled down to the same useless conclusion. Sometimes relationships end, sometimes they don't, and there's very little you can do to control which category yours falls into. But I couldn't accept that. I drove my rental car to a Starbucks and continued my research over endless cups of coffee while my friends nursed their hangovers back at the hotel. I expanded my search terms, looked for more specific advice, more recent studies, more success stories. I needed something that felt actionable, something that gave me hope that this wasn't just a passive waiting game. That's when I found it. Buried in the third page of Google results for How to Save Marriage When Husband Wants Space, a link to something called The Empowered Wife Podcast. The title alone intrigued me, not How to Fix Your Broken Husband or Marriage Crisis Survival Guide, but something about empowerment. Something that suggested I might have more agency in this situation than I'd realized. I downloaded a few episodes and started listening in my rental car as I drove aimlessly around Nashville. Not ready to face my friends' inevitable questions about my absence the night before. The host's voice was warm but direct, and she was interviewing women who had been exactly where I was, married to men who had suddenly become distant, who had asked for space, who had seemed to fall out of love overnight. But these weren't stories of passive victimhood. These were stories of women who had changed their approach entirely, who had stopped chasing and started attracting, who had focused on their own behavior instead of trying to control their husband's reactions. The concepts were foreign to everything. I'd read in traditional marriage advice, but they resonated in a way that felt almost dangerous. One woman's story in particular stopped me cold. She described herself as a control enthusiast who had managed every detail of her relationship, who had organized her husband's life and corrected his decisions, and essentially treated him like a project that needed her constant improvement. She talked about how she had confused control with love, how she had been so busy managing their relationship that she had forgotten to actually be in it. The recognition hit me like a physical force. I pulled over into a Target parking lot and sat there, engine running, as this stranger described my exact behavior patterns with uncomfortable accuracy. The way I organized David's schedule without asking, the way I corrected his stories when he told them to friends, the way I rearranged things he had already arranged, believing I was being helpful when I was actually communicating that his way wasn't good enough. I thought about the week before David left for Seattle, how I had reorganized his suitcase because I thought his packing method was inefficient, how I had called the hotel to upgrade his room without consulting him first, how I had printed out a detailed itinerary for his free time, complete with restaurant recommendations and directions to local attractions. At the time, I had felt proud of myself for being such a thoughtful, organized wife. Now, listening to this podcast, I realized I had been treating my husband like a child who couldn't manage his own business trip. The woman on the podcast talked about apologizing, not for everything, not in a self-deprecating way, but specifically for the ways she had been disrespectful. She talked about acknowledging her husband's competence instead of constantly trying to improve it. She talked about vulnerability and trust and letting go of the need to control outcomes. Everything she described was the opposite of everything I had been doing. I had been so focused on making our life perfect that I had forgotten to let David actually live it with me. I had been so busy being the CEO of our relationship that I had demoted my husband to an entry-level position in his own marriage. For the first time since David had said those terrible words, "I need some time," I felt something other than helpless confusion. I felt recognition. I felt like maybe, possibly, I had found a piece of the puzzle I hadn't even known I was missing. The podcast episode ended, and I sat in that Target parking lot for another 20 minutes, just thinking. Was this really what had happened to us? Had I controlled and managed and organized our love right into the ground? Had David asked for time because he needed space to remember who he was when I wasn't constantly telling him who he should be? I drove back to the hotel with my mind racing, already formulating what I would say to him when I got home. Not demands for explanations or promises to change everything if he would just come back, but an acknowledgement of something I was only beginning to understand about myself and about the dynamic I had created between us. My friends were getting ready for another night out, and this time I told them I was genuinely sick, which wasn't exactly a lie. I felt nauseous with the weight of this new self-awareness, dizzy with the possibility that I had been the problem all along without realizing it. I spent the rest of the evening planning what I would say to David when I returned to Columbus. Not the desperate, pleading conversation I had originally imagined, but something completely different. An apology that acknowledged specific behaviors rather than generic relationship mistakes. A recognition of his autonomy that I had been unconsciously undermining. A different way of showing up in our marriage that might possibly create space for him to want to show up too. That night, I took off my wedding ring for the first time since our ceremony 8 months earlier. I held it under the harsh fluorescent light of the hotel bathroom, watching it catch and scatter the light like tiny promises. It looked the same as always, the same diamond David had chosen, the same platinum band we had picked out together, the same symbol of forever that we had exchanged with such certainty. But did it still mean the same thing? Could a ring hold its promise when the people wearing it had forgotten how to honor what it represented? I turned it over in my palm, feeling its familiar weight, wondering if David was looking at his own ring with the same questions, wondering if either of us knew how to be married in a way that actually worked. For the first time since this nightmare had started, I had a glimmer of hope that maybe I could learn. The first thing I saw when I opened our front door wasn't David. It was his wedding ring, sitting quietly on our dining room table like a small, glittering verdict. It was 6 o'clock on a Tuesday evening in Columbus, and the late afternoon sun was streaming through our living room windows, creating long shadows across the hardwood floors we'd spent so much time choosing together. The house felt cold despite the warm light, empty in a way that had nothing to do with furniture and everything to do with the absence of hope I'd been carrying for the past week. I'd driven 4.5 hours straight from Nashville, practicing my apology speech the entire way. I'd rehearsed it at red lights, refined it during gas station stops, and whispered it to myself as I pulled into our driveway. I was nervous but hopeful, armed with new understanding about myself and our marriage, ready to have a completely different kind of conversation than any we'd had before. But that ring on the table stopped me cold. It wasn't carelessly tossed there or forgotten in a moment of distraction. It was placed there deliberately, precisely in the center of the table, like punctuation at the end of a sentence I wasn't ready to read. David was sitting on our couch, still wearing his work clothes, but he looked exhausted in a way that went deeper than physical tiredness. His shoulders were slumped, his hands clasped between his knees, and when he looked up at me, His face held the kind of resignation I'd seen in movies but never in real life. He looked like a man who had made a decision and was steeling himself to follow through with it. I set my overnight bag down carefully, my eyes darting between his face and the ring on the table. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it from across the room. This wasn't how I'd imagined this conversation would start. I'd expected awkwardness, maybe some defensiveness, but not this formal, final atmosphere that felt like a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided. "Hi," I said quietly, not moving from the entryway. "Hey." His voice was flat, controlled. "How was Nashville?" "It was fine. David, we need to talk." He nodded slowly, as if he'd been expecting this. "Yeah, we do." I walked into our living room and sat down on the chair across from him, not on the couch beside him like I normally would have. Something about his posture told me that physical proximity wasn't welcome right now. The space between us felt deliberately maintained, like a buffer zone he needed to keep his resolve intact. "I've been doing a lot of thinking while you were gone," I began, but he held up a hand to stop me. "Jess, I need to say something first." My stomach dropped. In 8 months of marriage, David had never interrupted me. He was always the one who waited, who listened, who let me finish my thoughts before sharing his own. But this David was different. This David had something to say that couldn't wait. "I'm not in this relationship anymore," he said simply. "I don't know if I love you anymore. I don't know if I ever loved you the way I should have. I don't know if I can be the husband you need me to be." The words hit me like physical blows. Each sentence was delivered with the same quiet certainty, the same matter-of-fact tone he might use to discuss the weather or weekend plans. But these weren't casual observations. These were marriage-ending declarations, delivered with the kind of calm that only comes after you've already grieved the loss of something. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to argue, to defend myself, to demand explanations and fight for our marriage the way I'd always fought for everything I wanted. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the podcast I'd listened to, or maybe it was seeing my wedding ring sitting 3 feet away from my husband's. But instead of launching into the debate I'd been preparing for, I heard myself say something I'd never said before in any difficult conversation we'd ever had. "Tell me more about that." David's head snapped up. He'd been bracing for an argument, for tears, for the emotional intensity that had characterized every difficult conversation we'd had over the past week. But I just sat there, looking at him with genuine curiosity, waiting for him to explain. What? "Tell me more about what you're feeling. I want to understand." For a moment, he just stared at me like I'd started speaking a foreign language. Then, slowly, he began to talk. He told me about feeling suffocated, about losing himself in our relationship, about how my constant improvements and suggestions had made him feel incompetent in his own life. He talked about dreading coming home because he never knew what I'd reorganized or what new system I'd implemented to make our life better. He told me about the business trip to Seattle, how good it had felt to make decisions without consulting me, to eat dinner at whatever restaurant struck his fancy without having to justify his choice or listen to a better suggestion. He talked about remembering who he was when I wasn't managing his existence, and how that person felt like a stranger he'd lost touch with. I listened without interrupting, without defending myself, without offering solutions. I just listened. And as he talked, I recognized every single behavior he described. The constant suggestions disguised as helpfulness. The way I'd reorganized his office space to be more efficient. The way I'd corrected his stories when he told them to friends. The way I'd taken over planning every social event, every vacation, every weekend, believing I was being thoughtful when I was actually being controlling. When he finished, the silence stretched between us like a bridge neither of us knew how to cross. Finally, I took a deep breath and said something I'd never said before in our relationship. "I owe you an apology." David's expression shifted from resignation to surprise. "What?" "I owe you a real apology. Not for being a bad wife or for making mistakes in general, but for specific things I've done that were disrespectful to you and to our marriage." I paused, choosing my words carefully, thinking about everything I'd learned about myself over the past few days. I'm sorry for treating you like you were incompetent. I'm sorry for reorganizing your life without asking you first. I'm sorry for not supporting you with your Korean culture and your family the way you needed me to. I'm sorry for making you feel like you had to run your decisions by me instead of trusting that you're a grown man who can handle his own life. The words felt strange in my mouth because I'd never apologized this way before. I'd apologized for hurting his feelings or for misunderstandings, but never for the specific ways my behavior had undermined him as a person. Never for the pattern of disrespect that I was only now beginning to see clearly. David's eyes filled with tears, which shocked me because I'd seen him cry maybe twice in our entire relationship. He stood up abruptly and walked toward the front door, and for a moment I thought he was leaving again. Instead, he just stood there, with his back to me, his shoulders shaking slightly. "Are you angry?" I asked quietly. He turned around and his face was a mixture of pain and something that looked almost like relief. "No," he said, his voice rough. "I'm not angry." "Then what? Are you feeling?" He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "I don't know. I've been waiting for you to say something like that for so long. I didn't think you could see it. I couldn't see it before, but I can see it now." We stood there looking at each other across our living room, and something had shifted. The formal, final atmosphere from earlier had changed into something more complex. The wedding ring was still on the table between us, but it no longer felt like a verdict. It felt more like a question mark. David grabbed his keys from the counter. "I need to go," he said. "I need to think about this." "Okay," I said, and I meant it. For the first time since this nightmare had started, I wasn't panicking about him leaving. I wasn't begging him to stay or demanding promises about when he'd be back. I was just letting him go, trusting that he needed space to process what had just happened between us. After his car pulled out of the driveway, I sat back down on the couch and stared at his wedding ring. It was still there, still sitting in the exact center of our dining room table, but somehow it looked different now. Less like an ending and more like a pause. I thought about the apology I'd just given. Instead of trying to convince David to feel differently about our marriage, I had simply acknowledged the reality of what I'd done wrong. Instead of defending my intentions, I had owned the impact of my actions. Instead of asking him to forgive me, I had just told him I was sorry. Was this how you saved a marriage? Not by fighting for it, but by acknowledging the ways you damaged it? Not by proving your love, but by admitting your failures? Not by convincing your spouse to stay, but by showing them you understood why they wanted to leave? I had no idea if David would come back. I had no idea if our marriage could survive this crisis. But for the first time in 2 weeks, I felt like I'd shown up as the person I actually wanted to be instead of the person I thought I was supposed to be. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to build something new on. The ring stayed on the table all night, catching the light from our kitchen whenever I walked past it. I didn't touch it, didn't move it, didn't try to put it back where it belonged. It would stay there until David decided what it meant, until he decided whether he wanted to wear it again, or whether it would become just another piece of jewelry with a story that ended too soon. But something had changed in our house that evening. Something had shifted between us in a way that felt significant, even if I couldn't yet understand what it meant. For the first time since David had said he needed time, I felt like maybe there was something worth waiting for. The text from David's sister, Sarah, contained exactly 3 words. Need to see you. I knew immediately that something was wrong. Sarah never contacted me directly. In the 8 months since David and I had been married, she'd maybe texted me twice. Once to ask what David wanted for his birthday, and once to coordinate a family dinner. She was polite but distant, the kind of sister-in-law who clearly loved her brother more than she trusted his choice in wives. So when her name popped up on my phone 2 days after my confrontation with David, my stomach immediately clenched with dread. We agreed to meet at a small coffee shop in Clintonville, One of those Columbus neighborhoods filled with eclectic local businesses and young professionals who biked to work. Snow was falling steadily outside the windows, the kind of heavy, wet flakes that stuck to everything and made the world look both beautiful and ominous. I arrived 15 minutes early and claimed a corner table, ordering a latte I knew I wouldn't be able to drink because my nerves were already making my hands shake. Sarah walked in precisely on time, shaking snow from her dark hair and scanning the room until she spotted me. She was 3 years older than David, with the same serious brown eyes and careful way of considering her words before speaking. But today she looked uncomfortable in a way I'd never seen before, like she was carrying information she didn't want to possess. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, sliding into the chair across from me without ordering anything. "I wasn't sure if I should call you or not." "What's going on?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Sarah stared at her, hands for a long moment, clearly wrestling with whether to proceed. "David told me you two are having some problems." "That's one way to put it," I said carefully. "Did he tell you anything specific?" "Not really, just that he needed some space to think things through." She paused, then looked directly at me. "But there's something I think you should know. Something he probably won't tell you himself." My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. "Okay." During his business trip to Seattle, he mentioned going out for coffee a few times with one of his colleagues, a woman named Jennifer from the marketing department. Sarah's voice was quiet but steady. "He didn't say anything inappropriate happened, but the way he talked about it, the way he mentioned her name multiple times, I just thought you should know." The words hit me like a physical blow, but strangely not in the way I expected. Yes, there was pain, sharp and immediate, like stepping on broken glass. But underneath the pain was something I hadn't anticipated. Relief. Finally, I had a piece of the puzzle that made sense. "How many times?" I asked. "What? How many times did they have coffee?" Sarah shifted uncomfortably. "He mentioned it at least 3 different times when we talked on the phone while he was there. Coffee on Tuesday, lunch on Thursday, drinks after work on Friday. Maybe more." I sat back in my chair processing this information. Part of me wanted to be furious, to demand details, to call David immediately and confront him. But a larger part of me felt something unexpected, understanding. Not acceptance, not approval, but a kind of clarity that I'd been missing for weeks. "I appreciate you telling me," I said finally. Sarah looked surprised. "You're not angry?" "I am angry, but I'm also relieved, I guess. For the past 2 weeks, I've been trying to figure out what changed, what I did wrong, why he suddenly became a different person. Now I have at least part of the answer." "I'm sorry, Jessica. I know this isn't what you wanted to hear." "No, it's not, but it's better than not knowing." I took a deep breath. "Did he say anything else about her? About what they talked about?" Sarah hesitated. "He said she was easy to talk to, that she listened without trying to solve his problems, that she made him feel like himself again." Each word felt like another piece of glass, but I forced myself to really hear what Sarah was telling me. David had found someone who listened without managing, who let him be himself without improvement suggestions, who gave him space to exist, without organizing his existence for him. Of course he had been drawn to that. Of course that felt refreshing after months of my well-intentioned but suffocating attention. "Thank you for telling me," I said again. "I know this was hard for you. What are you going to do?" I stared out the window at the falling snow, watching people hurry past bundled in coats and scarves, everyone focused on getting somewhere warm and safe. "I'm going to talk to him, but not the way I would have talked to him 2 weeks ago." Sarah looked confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I'm going to handle this differently than I've handled anything else in our marriage. I'm going to listen first and react second. I'm going to focus on understanding instead of defending myself. I'm going to see if we can have an honest conversation about what's actually happening here." We sat in silence for a few minutes, the weight of this revelation settling between us. Finally, Sarah reached across the table and touched my hand briefly. For what it's worth, I think he still loves you, but I think he's confused about what that means and whether it's enough. After Sarah left, I sat in that coffee shop for another hour, staring at my untouched latte and trying to figure out how I felt about what I'd just learned. The rational part of my brain was cataloging all the reasons to be devastated. My husband had formed an emotional connection with another woman. He had shared intimate thoughts and feelings with someone who wasn't his wife. He had found refuge from our marriage in the company of a stranger. But the part of my brain that had been listening to podcasts about marriage and reading about respect and control was asking different questions. Had I created an environment where David felt like he couldn't be himself? Had I been so busy trying to improve our relationship that I'd forgotten to simply enjoy his company? Had I made him feel like every conversation was a project management meeting, rather than a connection between two people who chose to love each other? I pulled out my phone and stared at David's contact information for a long time. Everything in my old pattern of behavior was screaming at me to confront him, to demand explanations, to fight for our marriage by pointing out all the ways this other woman was wrong for him, and I was right. But that approach had gotten us to this point in the first place. Instead, I typed a message that felt foreign but true. I know something happened in Seattle. I don't have details, but if you want to talk about it, I'm here to listen. I sent the text before I could second-guess myself, then drove home through the steadily falling snow, my mind quieter than it had been in weeks. I had information now. I understood at least part of why David had come home different, why he needed time to think, why our marriage had suddenly felt like a burden instead of a partnership. David's car was in our driveway when I arrived home, which surprised me because he'd been staying at Sarah's since our conversation about his wedding ring. I found him sitting at our kitchen table, staring at his phone, clearly having just read my message. "Hi," I said, hanging up my coat and sitting down across from him. "Hi." He looked nervous in a way I'd rarely seen, like a teenager who'd been caught breaking curfew. "Sarah told you." She did. We sat there looking at each other across our kitchen table, the same table where we'd eaten breakfast together every morning for months, where we'd planned our future and shared our days and built what I had thought was a solid marriage. Now it felt like neutral territory in a negotiation neither of us knew how to navigate. "Do you want to talk about it?" David asked quietly. I considered this question seriously. Did I want to hear details about David's connection with another woman? Did I want to know what she had given him that I hadn't? Did I want to subject myself to the pain of understanding exactly how my marriage had become something my husband needed to escape from? "Actually," I said, surprising myself, "now that you're here, I don't want to talk about it." David's eyebrows shot up. "You don't?" "I mean, maybe we need to eventually. But right now, I'm more interested in understanding what was missing here, that made you look for it somewhere else. I'm more interested in figuring out if we can create the kind of relationship where you don't need to find yourself in coffee shops with other women." David stared at me like I'd started speaking in code. In our entire relationship, I had never responded to a problem by focusing on my own contribution to it. I had never prioritized understanding over being right. I had never chosen curiosity over accusation. "I don't understand you lately," he said finally. "I don't understand myself lately either. But I think that might be a good thing." We talked for 2 more hours that evening. Not about Jennifer or Seattle or what had or hadn't happened during those coffee meetings, but about us. About the ways we had stopped seeing each other clearly, the ways we had started taking our connection for granted, the ways we had both contributed to creating a marriage that felt more like a business partnership than a love story. For the first time in weeks, David didn't leave when the conversation got difficult. For the first time since this crisis began, I didn't try to solve or fix or manage our problems. We just sat with them, acknowledging their existence without immediately jumping to solutions. That night, after David had gone back to Sarah's, I sat in our living room looking at my wedding ring. His was still on the dining room table where he'd left it days earlier. But mine was still on my finger, still catching the light, still representing a commitment I wasn't ready to abandon. Why wasn't I angrier? Why wasn't I devastated by the knowledge that my husband had found emotional intimacy with another woman? Why did I feel more curious than betrayed, more determined than defeated? Maybe because for the first time, I understood that this wasn't really about Jennifer or Seattle or coffee meetings. This was about David and me and the ways we had stopped nurturing what we'd promised to protect. This was about whether we could learn to love each other better or whether we would remain strangers who happened to share a mortgage and a last name. My wedding ring still meant something to me, even if David's was sitting 3 rooms away, separated from the finger it belonged on. But what it meant was changing, evolving from a symbol of promises made to a reminder of promises that still needed to be kept, day after day, choice after choice, conversation after conversation. The question wasn't whether David had feelings for someone else. The question was whether we could build something together that was worth choosing over the escape that other people represented. We were in the basement of our Columbus home, the same basement that had become David's unofficial bedroom over the past month. He'd moved down there after our conversations about Jennifer in Seattle, claiming he needed space but wasn't ready to move out completely. So there we were, living like roommates in a house we'd bought to be a family home, tiptoeing around each other's schedules and pretending this arrangement was sustainable. The atmosphere was suffocating. Every conversation felt loaded with unspoken questions. Every shared meal was punctuated by careful politeness that felt more exhausting than outright fighting would have been. We were existing in the same space but living completely separate lives, and the tension was eating away at both of us. I was at my breaking point. For weeks, I'd been walking on eggshells, implementing everything I'd learned about respect and listening and giving him space. I'd stopped organizing his life, stopped offering unsolicited advice, stopped trying to manage our relationship back to health, but nothing was improving. If anything, David seemed more distant than ever, more resigned to the idea that our marriage was over. That Tuesday evening, I found him in the basement sorting through boxes of his things, clearly preparing for a more permanent separation. There was a manila envelope on the coffee table that I recognized immediately, legal documents from the divorce attorney he'd been meeting with behind my back. "You're really going to do this?" I said, not a question but a statement. He looked up from the box of books he was packing. "Jessica, we can't keep living like this. We're both miserable." "I'm not miserable," I lied. "I'm confused and scared and sad, but I'm not ready to give up on us." "But I am," he said quietly. "I've been ready for weeks. I just didn't know how to tell you." That's when I broke down. Not the composed, respectful breakdown I might have planned, but the ugly, desperate crying of someone watching their entire life collapse in real time. I told him about my deepest fear, that no one would ever love me the way he had loved me in the beginning, that I was difficult and controlling and too much for anyone to handle long term. "I'm scared that if you leave me, I'll never find anyone who sees past all my flaws," I sobbed. "I'm scared that you were my one chance at being loved despite being impossible to live with." David stopped packing and looked at me with something that resembled his old tenderness. "You're beautiful," he said softly. "Why would you think that about yourself?" But even as he said it, even as his voice carried genuine concern for my pain, those divorce papers sat there on the table between us like a contradiction of every caring word. He could think I was beautiful and still want to divorce me. He could be concerned about my feelings and still be done with our marriage. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. That night, I made a decision that surprised even me. I couldn't stay in that house anymore, living in limbo, watching David prepare to leave while still sleeping under the same roof. I couldn't keep existing in this weird purgatory where we were still technically married, but essentially strangers. I needed to get out, to remember who I was when I wasn't defined by the failure of my marriage. I started packing the next morning. Not the careful, organized packing I usually did, but the frantic, desperate packing of someone who needed to escape before she lost her mind completely. I threw clothes into suitcases, gathered my toiletries, and made arrangements for our dog, Charlie, to come with me. "Where are you going?" David asked, finding me loading my car in the driveway. Florida, I said without looking at him. My college friend Emma has been telling me to visit for months. I figure now's as good a time as any. For how long? I don't know, until I figure out what I want. I could see the surprise in his eyes. For the first time since this whole crisis began, I was the one leaving. I was the one making a decision without consulting him, without asking permission, without trying to manage his reaction to my choice. The drive to Florida took 14 hours. I stopped twice for gas and once to walk Charlie at a rest stop in Georgia, but otherwise I just drove straight through, listening to music and podcasts and letting my mind wander for the first time in months. By the time I crossed the Florida state line, I felt like I could breathe again. Emma lived in a small beach town on the Gulf Coast, in a tiny apartment that was the complete opposite of the perfectly organized home I'd left behind in Ohio. Her place was cluttered and colorful, and filled with mismatched furniture that somehow worked together. She welcomed me with no questions asked, made up her couch for me to sleep on, and told me I could stay as long as I needed. The first week was hard. I cried a lot, slept too much, and called in sick to work more days than I should have. But gradually, something started to shift. Being away from Columbus, away from the constant reminders of my failing marriage, away from the house that felt like a mausoleum for my dreams, I started to remember who I was outside of being David's wife. I started working out every morning on the beach, running along the shoreline with Charlie and feeling my body get stronger. I started eating meals when I was hungry instead of cooking elaborate dinners that David barely touched. I started making decisions based on what I wanted instead of what might improve our relationship or demonstrate my worth as a partner. Emma introduced me to her social circle, and for the first time in months, I went out with people who didn't know about my marriage crisis, who weren't tiptoeing around my feelings or offering unsolicited advice about divorce attorneys. I laughed at dinners, danced at bars, and even went on a few casual dates with men who thought I was interesting and funny and worth getting to know. It was on one of those dates, sitting across from a perfectly nice marine biologist named Jake, who was telling me about his research on sea turtles, that I had a moment of clarity. I realized I was capable of being happy without David. I was capable of building a life that didn't revolve around saving my marriage or proving my worth as a wife. I was capable of existing as a complete person, not just half of a broken couple. But I also realized something else. I didn't want to be happy without David, not because I needed him to validate my worth or complete my identity, but because I genuinely enjoyed who I was when I was with him. The best version of myself wasn't the version that controlled and managed and improved everything around her. The best version of myself was the one who could love someone fully while still maintaining her own independence and strength. 6 weeks into my Florida exile, I made another decision that surprised me. I was going back to Ohio. Not because I was desperate to save my marriage at any cost, not because I couldn't survive without David, but because I couldn't make any real decisions about my future while running away from my problems. I needed to face whatever was going to happen between us with clear eyes and a strong sense of who I was, whether that meant fighting for our marriage or accepting its end. On the drive back to Columbus, I did something I'd never done before in our relationship. I texted David and asked if he wanted to go away for a weekend, not to have some romantic reunion, but to have the honest conversation we'd been avoiding for months. I suggested a cabin in the mountains of West Virginia, neutral territory where we could talk without the weight of our shared history pressing down on every word. I want to understand where we stand, I wrote. Not to argue or convince you of anything, but just to know what we're really dealing with here. We both deserve that clarity. To my surprise, he said yes. As I drove those familiar highways back toward Ohio, I kept touching my wedding ring, the same ring I'd worn throughout my entire time in Florida. I hadn't taken it off, even on the dates, even when other men had asked about my marital status. It had served as a reminder of the commitment I'd made, but also as a question I wasn't ready to answer yet. I had learned something crucial during those 6 weeks by the ocean. I had learned that I could survive without David, that I could build a life filled with joy and purpose and connection even if our marriage ended. But I had also learned that surviving wasn't the same as thriving, and that choosing to be with someone because you wanted to be with them was completely different from staying with them because you were afraid to be alone. I was driving back to Ohio as a different person than the one who had fled 6 weeks earlier. I was stronger, more confident, more aware of my own worth. But I was also more honest about what I really wanted. I wanted my marriage to work, not because I needed it to define me, but because I believed David and I had something worth fighting for if we could both show up as our best selves. The question was whether David had learned anything during our time apart, whether he had missed what we had together or simply enjoyed the peace of not having to deal with our problems. The question was whether the weekend ahead would be a last-ditch effort to save something unsalvageable, or the beginning of building something new on the foundation of who we'd both become. My wedding ring caught the afternoon sunlight as I gripped the steering wheel, crossing back into Ohio after 6 weeks of learning how to live without the man who had given it to me. It still fit perfectly, still caught the light the same way, still represented the same promise I'd made 8 months earlier. But what that promise meant, and whether it was a promise worth keeping, remained to be seen. It was 8 months after our crisis had begun. 8 months since David had first said he needed time to think. David had moved back to his sister's house after our weekend away, and we'd spent months slowly, carefully rebuilding something that looked like trust, but felt different than what we'd had before. Deeper, more intentional, more honest. David had decided he wanted to try again. Not try to go back to what we'd had, but try to build something new together. He'd been clear about this distinction, and I'd appreciated his honesty even when it scared me. This wasn't about returning to our old patterns or pretending our crisis hadn't happened. This was about consciously choosing to create a different kind of marriage with the same person. But even with all our progress, even with the honest conversations and the slow rebuilding of intimacy, I still had moments of doubt. Moments when I wondered if this was too good to be true, if David was trying to convince himself he loved me when he really didn't, if we were both just scared of starting over with other people. Those doubts had been particularly strong lately, as our relationship had started to feel genuinely good again. We'd started having lunch together once a week, then twice a week, then actual dinner dates that felt like dating. The chemistry between us was different now, not the desperate, possessive intensity of our early relationship, but something steadier and more sustainable. We laughed together more than we had in the last year of our marriage. We talked about books and movies and work and dreams, instead of just logistics and problems. David had started texting me funny memes during the day. I had started looking forward to seeing him in a way that felt choice-based rather than need-based. 3 weeks earlier, David had mentioned wanting to move back into our house. Not immediately, not as a grand gesture, but as a natural next step in whatever we were building together. "I want to try being married to you again," he'd said. "But I want to try being married to the person you are now, not the person you were before." "What's the difference?" I'd asked. "The person you are now doesn't try to manage my emotions. The person you are now asks me what I think instead of telling me what I should think. The person you are now trusts me to handle my own problems unless I specifically ask for help." He was right. I had changed, fundamentally and probably permanently. Not just my behavior, but my entire approach to relationships and control, and what it meant to love someone well. The woman who had frantically reorganized David's suitcase before his business trip felt like a stranger to me now. But David had changed too. He was more direct about his needs, more willing to have difficult conversations before they turned into crises, more intentional about showing up as a partner rather than just a participant in our shared life. I felt something I hadn't felt in almost a year. Genuine optimism about our future together. Not desperate hope or wishful thinking, but actual confidence that we could make this work because we'd both learned how to be better at loving each other. "Jessica," David said as we reached our cars, which we'd driven separately out of habit from the months when we weren't sure we were safe to be in the same vehicle together. "Yeah? I want to ask you something, but not here. Can you meet me at the house in an hour?" My stomach fluttered with nerves, but good nerves. Anticipatory nerves. Okay. I drove home slowly, taking the long way through neighborhoods I'd driven through hundreds of times but hadn't really seen in months. Everything looked different somehow. More colorful, more alive, more full of possibility. I realized I was nervous about what David wanted to ask me, but it was the kind of nervousness that comes before good things, not bad things. David's car was already in our driveway when I arrived, but he wasn't inside the house. He was standing on our front porch, looking like he was gathering courage for something. When he saw me get out of my car, he smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "Before we go inside," he said, "I have something to say." "Okay," I said, walking toward him but stopping a few feet away, giving him space to say whatever he needed to say. "This is probably going to sound crazy, but I want to ask you to marry me again." I stared at him. "We're already married." "No, we're not." "Not really. Not in any way that matters." He pulled something out of his pocket. My wedding ring, the one I'd taken off months ago and left on our kitchen counter the night I'd driven to Florida. We said vows to each other 8 months ago, but we didn't know how to keep them. We promised things we didn't understand how to deliver on. We committed to being people we didn't know how to be. David got down on one knee right there on our front porch, holding my ring in his outstretched hand. "Jessica, I want to marry the person you are now. I want to promise things to you that I actually know how to follow through on. I want to build a marriage with you based on who we've become, not who we thought we were supposed to be." My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. This wasn't the surprise proposal I'd dreamed about when I was younger. This was better. It was a conscious choice made by two people who had learned the hard way what marriage actually required. "I'm not walking through that door until you put this ring back on," he said. "But not because I'm trying to control your decision. Because I want you to know that this time, I'm choosing you with full knowledge of what that choice means. And I want to know that you're choosing me the same way." I looked at the ring in his hand. The same ring that had represented so many different things over the past year. Promise, disappointment, loss, hope, and now something new. Commitment that had been tested and found strong enough to survive reality. "Are you sure?" I asked. "Are you sure you want to be married to someone who spent 6 weeks in Florida dating other people? Are you sure you want to be married to someone who had coffee with his coworker and then needed 8 months to figure out what he actually wanted?" We looked at each other. We'd both made mistakes, we'd both learned from them. And we were both here by choice rather than by default. "Yes," I said, extending my left hand toward him. "I want to marry you again. I want to marry the person you are now." David slipped the ring onto my finger, and it fit perfectly, just like it always had. But it felt different now, not heavy, with expectations and fears, but substantial in the way that real commitments feel substantial. It was a reminder of what we'd been through together and what we'd chosen to build together. "Marriage 2.0, David said, standing up and kissing me for the first time in months. "Marriage 2.0, I agreed. I woke up to the smell of coffee and pancakes. David was making breakfast in bed, something he did twice a week now, not because I expected it, or because some marriage advice book had told him to, but because he enjoyed taking care of me in small ways, and I enjoyed being taken care of. "Good morning, wife," he said, setting a tray across my lap and kissing my forehead. "Good morning, husband," I replied, a greeting that felt both familiar and new every time we said it. Our marriage looked different now than it had during our first attempt. I was learning to cook Korean food with David's mother, not because I was trying to prove myself as a daughter-in-law, but because I was genuinely interested in understanding the culture that had shaped the man I loved. David was planning our social calendar with me, not because I was managing his life, but because we'd both learned that partnership meant sharing responsibilities rather than dividing them. We had real problems sometimes, disagreements about money, stress from work, occasional miscommunications that reminded us both how easy it would be to fall back into old patterns, but we had tools now for handling problems. ways of talking to each other that created connection instead of distance, methods for resolving conflict that strengthened our relationship instead of weakening it. People sometimes asked us how we'd saved our marriage, as if there was a formula they could apply to their own relationships. But the truth was, we hadn't saved our marriage. We'd let our first marriage end and built a new one in its place. We'd learned that love isn't enough if you don't know how to love well, and that commitment isn't enough if you're committed to the wrong version of partnership. Sometimes you have to lose something to truly appreciate it and learn how to keep it. Sometimes you have to let something die before you can build something that will actually live. Sometimes the ring has to come off before it can go back on with real meaning. My wedding ring caught the morning light as I reached for my coffee. The same ring David had given me twice now. The same symbol of the same commitment that had been tested and refined and chosen again. It was no longer just a promise of forever. It was a reminder of the journey we'd taken to become people who were actually capable of forever, one conscious choice at a time.